Today, we are going to discuss when you should shove all in a poker tournament when you start to get somewhat shallow stacked. This is a situation a lot of people mess up because they think their only options are all in or fold, but we will see today that is not true. In this video for coinpoker.com, we're going to be discussing the perfect short stacked strategy. Let's get right to it. Recognize that the number one mistake that small stakes players make when they get short stacked is that they give up, either by doing one of two things wrong. Usually, they play overly aggressive, they get their stack in, they think, oh, I need to gamble, I need to try to run it up so I'm not short anymore, and they usually get it in bad and lose. Alternatively, some players think, well, I'm just going to wait for aces, then they blind out. Sure, they get the last bit of their money in, but by blinding out, when they do get it in, they double up to some short stack again, and they haven't really accomplished anything. Recognize, though, you have to learn to play good, strong, fundamentally sound poker, and I'm going to be helping you learn that today. Also, this concept of grit, being able to persevere even when things are going poorly, just might be the most important characteristic of poker players in general, and that's especially true in tournaments because it's not like a cash game where you can take a bad beat and just quit. You got to sit there and continue playing great. And if you consistently continue playing great and fighting hard, even with your short stack, especially if your opponents don't, that's going to result in a lot of money flowing your direction in the long run. In order to do that, though, you're going to need to know when to go all in and how to take every profitable spot when you are short stacked, which means you have to study poker away from the table. And I'm going to be giving you a lot of key fundamental spots that you need to master and so that you can play these spots well. Today, you're going to learn when to push all in when everyone folds around to you. It's not just as simple as go all in with your good hands and fold your bad hands. Next, you're going to learn when to push all in against tight raising ranges, either because your opponent is in an early position and kind of has to be tight, or because they're just tight in general and they don't know to loosen up from late position. Alternatively, we're going to be also discussing when you should push all in against wide raising ranges. You're going to find that you should adjust very differently against tight raisers compared to loose raisers. In general, position matters a ton when you are playing short stacked. And you're going to find that you should play extremely differently based on your positions as your stack size gets shorter and shorter and shorter. When you are in early position, one of the first 2 or 3 people at the table, you are going to rarely go all in if you have fewer or if you have more than 12 big blinds. When you have fewer than 12 big blinds, that's when you can start to develop an all-in range. For example, here we are, 20 big blinds deep. In early position, we're raising the hands in red to 2 big blinds, folding the hands in blue, and notice we are not going all in with anything. If we have 15 big blinds, you can see this dark red color starting to sneak in from the early positions with king jack suited, king 10 suited, pocket sevens, and a few big aces, ace king, ace queen, and ace jack offsuit. But still, because we have more than 12 big blinds, we do not have much of an all-in range at all. If we get down to 12 big blinds, though, take a look at this. Now we're starting to go all in a lot. I'm going to explain how this range is developed in just a second so that you can logically structure ranges on your own. But notice we are now going all in with about 8% of hands, which is far more than, 0% when you have 20 big blinds. And as you get shallower and shallower, often you will go all in more and more and more. When you're in late position, though, which is a little bit different than early position, right? When you're in late position, there are fewer players yet to act. Now you can go all in for a wider range, even when you do have up to 20 big blinds. And you're going to start going all in a lot when you have something like 15 big blinds. Take a look at this. From the button with 20 big blinds, if it folds around to you, we already have an all-in range. 4s, 3s, and 2s, ace 4 suited, ace 3 suited, ace 2 suited, ace 8 offsuit, ace 7 offsuit, queen 10 suited, and king jack offsuit. Opt to go all in with a lot of the other decently strong hands raising. When we get shallower, 15 big blinds, we see far more all-ins with lots of ace X offsuit, pocket 7s and lower, ace 9 suited and lower, offsuit Broadway hands, and some marginal, suited connected type stuff. And then with 12 big blinds on the button, if they fold to us, well, you now see we're going all in a ton, 27% of the time. So notice, a few things are happening here, right? When you are in early position with 12 big blinds, you only get to shove about 8% of hands all in. That is this chart here, because you have to worry about far more players yet to act behind you randomly waking up with a strong hand. But from the button, since you now only have to worry about the small blind and big blind, you get to go all in far wider. Okay? Having fewer players yet to act means you shove more often. Having lots of players yet to act means you're going to want to min raise more often and see what develops. Just because as more and more players are yet to act behind you, they will inevitably wake up with a strong hand some portion of the time, and you don't want to have a junky hand all in when that is the case. You'd rather min raise it and then fold. So how do we develop these ranges logically? Well, when it folds to you and you have a short stack, your range should consist of 3 different actions. You should raise to 2 big blinds some portion of the time. You should go all in some portion of the time. And you should just open fold some portion of the time. Now you're going to fold all your garbage, of course. But how do you separate your playable hands into min raises and all ins? Well, your min raise range should consist of hands that are good enough to raise and then call or go all in if your opponent re-raises or goes all in. These are your overly premium hands like big pairs, strong suited high cards, etc. These are hands you're going to min raise and then call off against your opponent's aggressive actions. You're also going to want to raise with hands that are not quite good enough to go all in and will fold if your opponent re-raises. These are going to be your raise folds. And then all the hands that are kind of between these two hands that are good, but not good enough to necessarily want to raise and induce action, but also too good to raise and then fold to an all in. These are going to be the hands you opt to go all in with yourself. So let's take a look at the 12 big blind range under the gun or from early position. Notice the hands at the top portion of this little arrow, aces, kings, queens, jacks, tens, ace, king suited, ace, queen suited, ace, jack suited, ace, 10 suited, and ace, king offsuit. These are all hands you're going to min raise and then call if your opponent goes all in. Same with 8, 7s, 6s, 5s, and 4, or 6s and 5s if you have them. These other hands, though, ace 8 suited, ace 5 suited, king 9 suited, queen 9 suited, ace 10 offsuit, ace 9 offsuit, king jack offsuit, and queen jack offsuit. These are hands we are going to min raise and then fold if someone yet to act goes all in, because these hands are very, very likely to be dominated. And then the hands in dark red are opting to just go all in, because when you have a hand like, let's say, pocket 7s, you don't really want to min raise, then have your opponent go all in with, well, much of anything, unless it's a small pair, because you're usually flipping. You'd rather make them fold out stuff like jack 10 suited or queen jack offsuit, right? Whereas if you min raise, they will give you action or perhaps even go all in, and then you have to call it off roughly flipping. And that's not necessarily ideal. So you'll see this pattern occur over and over. Let's take a look at 15 big blinds on the button. Notice now, again, the range is pretty obvious what's min raising and calling off, right? We have 7s and better, min raising and calling off. All the suited Broadway hands up here that are min raising and calling off. Ace king, ace queen are raising and calling off. These ace x suiteds are usually close, probably calling off if your opponent's aggressive, folding if they're not. And then all these other hands like queen 8 suited, 10 7 suited, 8 7 suited, king 9 offsuit, 10 9 offsuit are obviously min raising and then folding to an all in. And by doing this, your opponents will not know if you're min raising with a really strong hand that's going to happily call it off or a junky hand that's going to fold. And that keeps your opponents guessing, which is very, very important. If your only options were limited to all in or fold, well, essentially what would happen is if you took a look at this chart, all these hands that are on the bottom of playability, such as king 3 suited, queen 4 suited, jack 5 suited, 8 6 suited, 10 9 offsuit, jack 9 offsuit, king 8 offsuit, etc., you would have to fold those. But by using this strategy of min raising some hands and going all in with some hands, you get to raise with a wider range, which allows you to play more hands profitably, which is very, very beneficial. Okay? So when you are between this 12 and 20 big blind stack depth, you want to make sure you have these 3 raising types or raising actions in your range. 2 big blind raise, all in, and fold. Now, how should you play against someone who is raising tighter than normal or just raising tight in general because they're raising from early position? Well, against these players, you're going to want to go all in less often before the flop because their raising range is stronger and they're going to call off more often against an all in just because they don't have junky hands in their range. So since you don't want to go all in quite as often, that's going to result in you calling more often pre-flop with hands that generally flop well. Also, because your opponent should be tight, or you expect your opponent to be tight, the players behind you are going to be less likely to go all in as well if they're paying any attention whatsoever. And that means you're actually going to get to see the flop with the hands that flop well. You don't want to be calling all that often if a tight player raises, someone calls, and then your opponents yet to act are all very likely to go all in because they're lunatics. In that scenario, well, you just don't get to play a whole lot of hands. Certainly not ideal, but that's how it goes sometimes. So which hands do you want to call with? Well, you're going to want to call with hands that don't do especially well against the initial raiser's range, but have okay equity. That said, you're going to find that middle pairs and the best high cards pretty much always want to go all in because they're usually ahead and they can get some hands that have decent equity to fold. Also, you're going to find that when you have a shallow stack, you usually want to just call preflop raises with pocket aces to force your opponent to stay in the pot with the weakest portion of their range. And while it may be tempting to just fast play aces against a tight range, because like I said, they're kind of less likely to fold, when you have exactly 2 aces in your hand, it blocks your opponent from having some hands that will put their money in, like ace king, ace queen, ace jack, etc. So you're probably still best off slow playing. Let's take a look at 2 charts. Here we have a 15 big blind strategy against an under the gun minimum raise to 2 big blinds. So this is when your opponent should be tightest and when you get to call very loose because you are on the button. Notice we are still going along with our best high cards, ace king, ace queen, ace jack, some king queen suited, and some pairs, mainly pocket fives and better. And then we're calling aces to slow play, and then some good suited aces, good suited Broadway hands, and good suited connectors, plus some king queen offsuit and ace jack offsuit. Now, if you told me your opponent was even tighter than normal, perhaps I would not shove the smallest pairs like 6s and 5s. Maybe not king 10 suited and queen 10 suited. I would opt to just call those. Same thing with king queen offsuit, maybe even ace jack offsuit. And these, I'm not going to say you should fold, but if your opponent's literally raising like the top 7% of hands, king queen and ace jack are going to be dominated a large chunk of the time. So that should result in you just not even playing those hands. But notice you do get to have a lot of calls off of a 15 big blind stack. And this is something a lot of people are not aware of. They think if someone raises, their only option with 15 big blinds is to go all in or fold. But you will see that would be a pretty big mistake, especially against this tight range. You want to call all these hands that flop reasonably well. And as you expect the players in the blinds to go all in less often, you can actually call a little bit wider, especially with these suited, connected, implied odds hands, even though you're not getting amazing implied odds. Let's take a look now at the small blind strategy against an under the gun raise. So this is when under the gun raises, it folds around to you in the small blind, 15 big blinds deep. You see, again, you get to call pretty wide, right? And this is now because there's only one more player remaining to act in the big blind who can randomly wake up with a strong hand. And this allows you to call with all these hands that flop well. Suited aces, strong suited kings, suited connectors, right? These are all hands that flop very, very well. Also, king, queen, king, jack, and ace 10 offsuit do a lot of calling too. That said, you are still going all in with a good, strong linear range of something like pocket pairs, suited Broadway hands, and ace jack and better. Don't be afraid to get it all in, even against a relatively tight range, regardless of where the raise comes from. Now, the reason we're using the under the gun raise in this spot is because that is the tightest range your opponent should reasonably have. But if your opponent raises the button with a tight range, because they think they're supposed to be tight in this scenario for whatever reason, well, you should not pretend or presume you're playing against a normal button raising range. You're playing against a tight under the gun raising range that just happens to be from the button. So always account for the specific strategy adjustments your opponents will be making and then adjust logically. But as you see, this pattern generally holds true. The suited, connected, implied odds hands do still want to call even against a 2 big blind raise when you only have 15 big blinds. They do not want to go all in, and they also don't want to fold. Now, don't get carried away with this and think you can call with the 9-6 suited or the jack 4 offsuit. These hands are not quite good enough to play or nowhere near good enough to play. If you get too loosey-goosey and eat a sandwich all the time, you're going to lose your money. So make sure you are playing reasonable ranges. Now, what should you do if instead of playing too tightly, your opponent's playing too loosely? This is when your opponent's going to raise perhaps a button range from under the gun, or from the button, maybe instead of raising with 45 or 50% of hands, they're raising with 80% of hands. Well, you're going to want to attack them aggressively. You want to fight fire with fire, because defending against an all-in with a wide raise first in range is extremely difficult. Consider what happens if they raise 80% of hands from the button and you go all in for 15 big blinds. Well, what are they going to do if they're sitting here with the jack 4 offsuit or the 9-6 suited or any of the marginal hands that are not premium? Well, they're probably going to fold, right? And that's going to result in them giving you their 2 big blind raise plus the big blind plus the small blind plus the 1 big blind ante. And if you only have 15 big blinds, adding 5 big blinds to your stack is very, very valuable. So if you can get just a few of those steals through against overly loose raising range, you are going to crush your opponents. I actually figured this out a long time ago, 20 years ago. I wrote about this play in my first book, Secrets of Professional Tournament Poker, which I have since recently remade. Make sure you check it out if you have not already. But this is a tactic that has been around forever. If your opponents raise too wide and don't call off often enough, you will crush them with blind aggression. That said, you can still flat call with some of your in-between hands that flop decently well, but really, against people who raise too wide and will not call off against your all-in often enough, focus on shoving. Let's take a look at how to play against the GTO strategy. This is when the button raises. This is when the cutoff raises, and you're on the button playing 15 big blinds deep. Notice you do mostly all-ins or folds, with only a few calls with some trap pocket aces, which allows you to call with a few other weaker hands like ace-6 suited, king-10 suited, queen-9 suited, and some small and medium pairs. But then you're going all in with lots of suited aces, ace-9 offsuit and better, lots of suited Broadway hands, king-queen offsuit, king-jack offsuit, and most of your pairs. This is because whenever you do shove all in with a hand like pocket eights and your opponent folds out jack-10 offsuit, that's fantastic, right? Or if they fold out ace-x suited or anything really. Anytime they fold, it's great because you add 4.5 big blinds to your stack. There are 2 big blinds, the small blind, the big blind, and the ante. That is highly valuable, so you want to be overly aggressive. If your opponent's raising the cutoff wider than normal, you should in turn go all in even wider. Maybe all suited aces, maybe all suited hands with 2 cards 9 or higher, all pairs, maybe queen jack, king 10 offsuit, ace 9 offsuit, maybe even ace 8 offsuit. You can get very aggressive if your opponent's going to raise and then fold off too often because their range is too wide. Take a look at the same scenario, but now the cutoff raises and you're in the small blind. Because you're out of position, and because if you call, the big blind should now go all in somewhat wide because the cutoff should be kind of loose. Well, now you don't even have a calling range. You go all in with every hand you're going to play. All suited aces, ace-7 offsuit and better, plus ace-5 offsuit, 2 suited cards 9 or higher, queen-jack offsuit, king-queen offsuit, king-jack offsuit, and all pairs. And again, if the cutoff's going to raise wider, you also get to go all in wider, which will punish them for opening too wide and not defending adequately. I cannot make this any more clear. If someone raises too wide and does not call off against the all-in often enough, you will absolutely crush them with blind aggression. And I know this chart recommends playing only the top 22% of hands, but you can get a lot wider if your opponents will fold too often. So that is it. That is the perfect short stack strategy in tournaments. When the action folds to you, first, focus on your position. If you're in early position, you got to be pretty tight, and you shouldn't be going all in all that often. In late position, you can be wider, and you can open shove more often, and then build 2 reasonable ranges. The first range raises to 2 big blinds with your absolute best hands and some hands that are not quite good enough to go all in. And your second range is just going to go all in. This is going to be a good, reasonably strong condensed range, like we showed earlier. All the hands that are kind of in the middle of the raise calls and the raise folds. Against tight players who raise first in, go all in with your best hands, but don't forget your option to call. If your opponent's going to call your all in a decent amount of the time, you don't want to be shoving with your medium strength stuff. And against wide raise first ins, attack them by jamming a lot, more often than the GTO strategy even recommends. That's it for today. Good luck in your games. I hope you enjoyed today's video. If you did, do me a favor, click the like and subscribe button down below. Click the notification bell. Huge thanks to coinpoker for making this happen. Good luck in your games, and I'll talk to you next time.